Rebekah. The Seven Sisters Series Book 4. By Amelia C. Adams. Chapter 1. Bagley, Texas. May 1985. We have a 14-year-old girl complaining of severe abdominal pain, fever, and vomiting, the paramedic called out as a gurney was pushed through the emergency room doors. Rebekah McClain tossed the patient file she was looking at onto the counter at the nurse's station and ran to join the team guiding the stretcher into one of the bays in the emergency room. They lifted the girl off the stretcher and onto the bed. Her name? Amber, the paramedic replied. Amber, my name is Rebekah, and I'm a nurse. Is it all right if I examine you? The girl nodded. Tears rolled down her cheeks, whether from pain or fear, Rebekah wasn't sure. Where are her parents? They followed us in their car. Rebekah placed her hands on the girl's abdomen. All the symptoms seemed to indicate the appendix, but she didn't sense anything there. Odd. She moved her hands to the side, and there, so much heat rising from that area, and a slight vibration. She closed her eyes and focused, opening them again when she heard Dr. Hunsaker's voice. What do we have here? This is Amber. 14 years old, presenting with symptoms of an ovarian cyst, Rebekah replied. Ovarian cyst? That's not typical for such a young woman. Dr. Hunsaker frowned. Just what are the symptoms? Severe abdominal pain, fever, and vomiting, Rebekah replied. She glanced over at the paramedic. They usually left after delivering their patients, but he was hovering around for some reason, and she'd have to ask him why later. That sounds like the appendix to me, Dr. Hunsaker said. We need to get her into the OR now. Yes, we do, but please, Dr. Hunsaker, do an ultrasound first, Rebekah said. If this is a cyst and she's been opened up for an appendectomy. Dr. Hunsaker exhaled. Are we going to have another one of those conversations again? It had been over a year since the weird event when the 7 McClain sisters had all been zapped by a power outage at their parents' house. Since that time, they'd each manifested different strange powers, and Rebekah's was the ability to diagnose. As a nurse, she'd had the ability to use her gift over and over again, but when her opinion contradicted the decisions of the doctors she worked with, things got more than a little awkward. Sir, please just take a few minutes to do an ultrasound. I won't say another word, I promise. Dr. Hunsaker scowled. You? Not say another word? I'll believe that when I see it. Ultrasound. A tech wheeled the machine over, and within moments, Dr. Hunsaker was scowling. There's nothing wrong with her appendix. Fine, let's look at the ovaries. The screen revealed some definite abnormalities on the right ovary. Get her up to the OR, Dr. Hunsaker called out. He turned to Rebekah. My office after the procedure. Yes, sir. A man and a woman rushed into the ER, looking around frantically until they spotted Amber. Is she all right? The woman asked. We would have been here sooner, but traffic was horrible, the man added. Your daughter is suffering a ruptured ovarian cyst, Dr. Hunsaker explained. In most cases, these resolve themselves, but I don't feel confident that this one will. We'll take her into surgery and see what's going on in there, all right? Yes, please. Do whatever you need to do, the man said, and the woman nodded. As Amber was being wheeled away, Rebekah said to the parents, You can go with her up to the doors of the operating room. They'll show you where to wait. Thank you, the woman said, and they followed behind their daughter. Rebekah sucked in a deep breath. They'd be able to manage the situation once they were in the OR, but if they'd waited, things would have become much worse. The time wasted in looking in the wrong place, not to mention having to change surgery sites. I'd take your lunch break now, if I were you, Harriet, the charge nurse, said as she walked up to Rebekah. You know Dr. Hunsaker's going to rake you up one side and down the other, you'll need your strength for that. Rebekah chuckled and shook her head. I definitely know it. Thanks, I'll just be in the cafeteria. As she walked down the hall, she saw the paramedic still standing there, and she motioned at him with her head. Come on. He looked confused for a moment, but then fell into step beside her. She didn't slow down to wait for him. She had half an hour, and she didn't intend to waste any of it. So, what's your story? She asked him. My story? Yeah. Why are you still here? I thought you were supposed to dump and run. We usually do, but it's the end of my shift, and I wanted to see how this one turned out. He paused. Actually, that's not true. She turned to look at him. We've only just met, and you're already lying to me? You don't mess around, do you? Never mind. You can explain while I eat. She moved through the cafeteria line quickly, grabbing some pre-made items rather than waiting to be served. Then she sat down and arranged her sandwich, chips, and fruit in front of her. You didn't want anything? She asked. He shook his head. Dinner at my parents' house tonight. My mother would kill me if she knew I ate anything first. Rebekah unwrapped her sandwich. You talk while I eat. Not trying to be rude, I'm just in a hurry. Right. Sorry. Okay, I stuck around because I wanted to see how the case turned out, at least, to start. But then I overheard your diagnosis. How did you do that? How did I do what? She didn't meet his gaze as she opened her chips. How did you know it wasn't her appendix? I brought in dozens of ruptures. I could have sworn that's what it was. Rebekah chewed on a chip while she thought up a reply. She hated lying, she hated it so much. My sister had a ruptured cyst last year, and they thought it was her appendix, she said at last, cringing a little bit. So that was the first thing I thought of. It was more of an educated guess than anything. That was more than a guess. Well, I did say it was educated. She flashed him a grin, hoping that some humor would lighten the tension. She wasn't about to tell this total stranger how she'd managed to diagnose Amber's cyst. It was none of his business, anyway. I'm Rebekah McClain. I'm Jeremy Burton. It's nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. You're new. I know all the emergency personnel in this town, and I haven't seen you before. Just moved here last week. I used to live in San Antonio, but I was ready for something quieter. Well, Bagley is definitely quieter. Are your parents in San Antonio? Yeah. I'd actually better be on my way soon if I don't want to be late. I've clocked the drive at an hour if traffic's good. He said that, but he still didn't make a move to stand up. Have you been a paramedic long? A couple of years. I got into it after my brother was almost killed in a car accident. Some quick-thinking first responders saved his life, and I realized that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make that kind of difference. Rebekah studied him while she chewed. He had a kind face and gentle eyes, and she could see him inspiring trust in the people he worked to save. That's a great reason to get into this profession. If you don't have the passion, you won't survive. And what about you? How long have you been a nurse? I went to nursing school pretty much right after high school, but lately, I've been thinking about going to medical school. She kept her voice a little non-committal, not telling him that her application had actually just been sent off. She wouldn't know until September if she'd been accepted, and there wasn't any point in making it public, especially since, yet again, it wasn't any of his business. He nodded. After seeing you in there just now, I think you'd be a great doctor. And they'd looped right back around to the topic she'd been trying to avoid. Thank you. I appreciate it. She took a few more hurried bites, gathered up her trash, and dumped her tray, then started walking back toward the ER. Jeremy walked alongside her, almost as if he didn't know where else to go. She kind of wanted to ask him to go away. She really needed a few minutes to work through what she was going to say to Dr. Hunsaker, but that would be rude. Plus, just then, another ambulance came pulling into the bay. A 40-year-old male, GSW, to the chest, the paramedic called out, this one a middle-aged woman. Blood pressure is falling fast. Rebekah glanced around. Harriet was the only other nurse around at the moment. They didn't get a lot of emergencies in this little hospital, so they were never fully staffed. She was supposed to have another 8 minutes on her break, but that didn't matter. Over here, she said, grabbing the end of the stretcher and guiding it toward a bed. They lifted the man into position, and she could see that blood had completely saturated the gauze padding that had been put on him in the field. She touched his chest briefly, just to verify, no doubt about it. This man was going to bleed out. Harriet, we've got to get him into surgery. He's going to bleed out. The bullet went through his left main coronary artery. I'll run up to the OR and see where Dr. Hunsaker is on that cyst, Harriet said over her shoulder, already in motion. And I'll page Dr. Smith, maybe he can get here faster than Dr. Hunsaker can close. Rebekah pressed on the wound, but it didn't matter how much pressure she applied, he was going to keep bleeding until he was stitched. Help me, she said to Jeremy, who was still, for some reason, hanging out. He seemed to know what she needed and grabbed the end of the bed. Together, they maneuvered it toward the operating room, where Rebekah scrubbed up and began preparing the patient for surgery. She wasn't an OR nurse and she had very little experience on this side of the swinging doors, but she'd do whatever she could to help speed things up for the surgical team. Jeremy seemed uncertain, but after a moment, he scrubbed up too and asked how he could help. Just a few minutes later, Dr. Hunsaker burst in, looking furious. What in the blue blazes is going on in here? This man's about to die, Rebekah said. We don't have any time to lose. He looked at her, then at the man on the table. Without replying, he headed over to the sinks, stripped off his gloves and gown, and scrubbed, then dressed in new sterile clothing. Ethan, the OR nurse who had been following him like a shadow, also changed, and they were back in record time. You, out, Dr. Hunsaker said to Rebekah, and she gave a nod before stepping away. She went out into the hall, Jeremy following her. You'd better start that drive if you want to be on time for dinner, she said absently. Dinner? Oh, that's right. He hesitated. Listen, can I see you later this week? I need. She shook her head. I'm sorry, Jeremy. I'm really busy, and I just don't. I mean. He held up a hand. No, it's all right. I get it. I really do. He gave her a smile. I'll see you around. Thanks for your help in there. Getting the patient ready. Yeah. I hope you don't get in too much trouble for that. I've been in trouble for over an hour. A little extra isn't going to hurt me. He smiled again. Okay. See ya. She watched him go, then slumped on the counter at the nurse's station. Oh, she was in so much more trouble than she'd let on. Chapter 2. Jeremy stopped by his apartment for a quick shower and change of clothes, then was on his way to San Antonio. It looked like he'd be about 15 minutes late, but maybe when he explained to his mother that there had been a girl involved, she'd forgive him. She was always asking when he was going to find a nice girl. Not that he'd actually found one, but he'd met one, and that had to count for something. Rebekah McClain. He had no idea what had just happened. Who was she, and how? He shook his head. It was like she somehow knew what was going on inside her patient even though she couldn't see it. Maybe he could have accepted her explanation about the cyst, but the main coronary artery? The left one? That was too specific to be a guess, even an educated one. He also knew from talking to the other paramedics that they didn't get many gunshot wounds in this small town, so it's not like she would have a lot of experience with them. Part of him felt like he should just let the whole thing drop and pretend like he didn't notice anything. But a much larger part of him wanted to know more, to figure out just what he'd witnessed. He knew he hadn't imagined it, it was a real, solid thing, and his imagination wasn't that good anyway. The real question was, would she tell him? By the time he pulled up to his parents' house, he'd decided that he would go down to the hospital the next day and see if she'd agree to have dinner with him, for longer than 30 minutes. Maybe he was intruding and maybe he should leave her alone, but his curiosity was eating him up inside, and he wanted answers. His brother, Greg, answered the door, reaching the knob easily from his motorized wheelchair. "Hey, Jeremy," he said as he maneuvered backward to let Jeremy in. "You're a little late." "Yeah, I know, I'm sorry." "Is Mom freaking out?" "Well, she hasn't called the highway patrol yet to see if there's been an accident, so you're probably good." Greg grinned and led the way into the kitchen. "Look who's here, Mom." Hannah Burton turned from the stove. "Well, if it isn't Jeremy. You could have called to tell us you'd be late, you know how I worry." "I do know, Mom." She hadn't been so uptight before Greg's accident, but ever since then, if she didn't know where everyone was at all times, she'd fret. Jeremy could understand it, and he also knew that it was hard on her when he decided to become a paramedic. They were each dealing with their feelings about Greg's accident in their own ways. "I'll call next time." "See that you do." She set down her mixing spoon and took the pot from the heat. "Greg, call your father for dinner, please." Greg steered his wheelchair over to the top of the stairs that led down to the basement. "Dinner, Dad." "How's he been?" Jeremy asked quietly, nodding toward his brother. "He's had some pain this week," Hannah replied. "His doctor put him on a different medication, but we can't see that it's doing any good. There are some things Greg's just going to have to live with." That might be true, but what a horrible truth. Jeremy hated the thought of his brother enduring that kind of pain every day for the rest of his life. Of course, he was grateful that Greg still had a life, but if there was a way to reduce the pain, he'd do whatever it took to find it. Hannah carried the last serving dish over to the table, and Jeremy grabbed the pitcher of water that was on the counter. A moment later, Thomas Burton came up the stairs and joined his family. "How was your drive?" he asked Jeremy just as he always did, and Jeremy replied that it had been fine, just as he always did. Things between Jeremy and his father had always been strained, but even more so after the accident. Jeremy believed his father blamed him for it, and Thomas had never done anything to prove him wrong. "Time to say grace," Hannah said, and they all bowed their heads. Jeremy said amen as was expected, but he didn't register a single word his father had said during the short prayer. He'd been trying to figure out how to change some of these family dynamics that had been in place for so long, they seemed implacable. His mother, always devoted, always concerned, always plugging away at whatever challenge she was presented with. His father, hardworking, difficult to please, uncommunicative. Greg, optimistic, long-suffering, the peacemaker. And then there was Jeremy, who was the fixer, the one who wanted to mend all the fences and knit together all the bones and patch up all the seams. None of these roles were wrong, necessarily, but the family wasn't working together, it was fraying at all the edges, each person going through the motions separately instead of coming together to share their pains and their triumphs. "Jeremy, have some potatoes." He took the dish from his mother and put some steaming mashed potatoes on his plate, then passed the bowl to his right. Everything went around the table in a well-choreographed dance until everyone had some of everything, and then the expected interrogation began. "So, Jeremy, how are things going for you in Bagley? Do you like your apartment?" "Yeah, I do. It's not too far from work, and it's furnished, so that's nice, saved me from having to find some furniture." "That's good. And have you found a church out there yet?" Jeremy grinned. He'd thought the question about girls would come first. I haven't been yet because I was busy moving in last Sunday, but I saw one in town that I think I'll check out next week. Hannah took a bite of her chicken, then turned her attention back to him. Any nice girls? I was waiting for that question. Jeremy chuckled. There seem to be a lot of girls in Bagley, but I haven't asked any of them out yet, I just got there. But there is someone, Hannah persisted. I can see it on your face. How can you see something like that on a person's face? Thomas asked. Let the boy eat his dinner. I think Mom's right, Greg said. Look, Jeremy's turning red. I'm not turning red. Jeremy shook his head, knowing he'd get no peace until he said something. I did meet a girl at the hospital today, a nurse in the ER. But I only talked to her for a few minutes, and I don't know anything about her. But you're going to go back, right? Hannah asked. I'm sure I'll see her a lot. And yes, I'll find out more about her. That was definitely a promise he intended to keep. The mystery of Rebekah McClain was going to nag at him until it was solved. Well, that sounds promising. You'll bring her for dinner sometime, of course. If we start dating, which isn't guaranteed, and if it starts getting serious, which isn't even on the table right now, yes, I'll bring her. Jeremy turned to his brother. Time to take the heat off me. How are your ham radio classes going? Good, Greg replied. I'll have my license next week, and then I can help out with natural disasters and all kinds of things from right here at home. My way of giving back. And it's much safer than your way, Hannah said, turning back to Jeremy. The way you're constantly running toward danger. Mom, I'm not the one in danger, Jeremy replied. I'm helping people get out of danger. Well, I still worry. It's my prerogative as a mother. We know that, and we love you for it, but we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, Jeremy replied. They'd had this conversation several times as well. It seemed that most of their dinner-time conversations were repeats of things they'd already discussed quite a bit, but he knew she'd never really understand. The call to be a first responder wasn't the same as the call to do something else, and it wasn't something he could explain. They finished up the meal with a peach cobbler. Jeremy helped his father move some heavy boxes out to the garage, and then he told everyone goodnight. He laughed and shook his head as he walked out to his car. He loved his family, even though they had their little moments of strangeness. He supposed every family did. Rebekah braced herself before knocking on Dr. Hunsaker's door. She'd been trying to think of a way to explain her actions, but short of telling him about her powers, she didn't know what to say. Her sisters were the only ones who knew what she could do. Well, the men in her older sisters' lives also knew, but that didn't help her out now. She didn't know what would help. How could she explain it in a way that wouldn't sound like she'd lost her mind? More importantly, would she be able to keep her job, or was she about to be fired from doing something she loved? Knowing she couldn't delay any longer, she raised her hand and knocked, entering when she heard, "Come in." Dr. Hunsaker sat behind his desk and took off his glasses when she came in. "Have a seat," he said, motioning toward the chair across from him. Rebekah sat down, trying to decide if she should speak first or wait for him. He solved that problem by starting to talk as soon as she was in her chair. "Nurse McClain, you've been with this hospital for 3 years. You excelled in nursing school, you came to us with excellent references from Dr. Gardner's office, and you've never missed a day of work. I can't find any patient complaints in your file, and your supervisors never have anything negative to say about you. Yes, I've done a little digging over the last 20 minutes. Tell me why it is that over the course of the last year, let's say, I find myself constantly at odds with you. You're contradicting my orders, you're doing things without authorization, you're making wild speculations, and perhaps the most confusing thing of all is that you've been right an amazing number of times. I don't understand what's going on." Should I fire you for insolence, or give you a raise for your excellent work? Being chief of staff is a pretty hard job, and you're not making it any easier on me. Even without touching him, because that would be awkward, Rebekah sensed that he was getting a bad headache, and she knew she was the cause. She had to think of a way to make this right. Dr. Hunsaker, I'm sorry, I know I'm putting you through a lot. I don't mean to contradict you or make things harder for you. I'm just a very opinionated person, and sometimes my instincts steer me in a different direction. That was a terrible answer, but the words wouldn't come. You realize that by taking that man into the operating room, you could have introduced any number of germs, subjected him to new diseases, and ruined the entire procedure, all because you believed you were saving his life? I do realize that, sir. But tell me, when you got in there, what did you find? Dr. Hunsaker sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. The bullet had gone through the left coronary artery, just like you said. Yes, he would have died if we hadn't operated immediately. She didn't reply. There was nothing more to be said. He finally met her gaze square on. You're not fired, but I will be watching you closer than you've ever been watched before. I can't have strange things happening in this emergency department. We have too many people depending on us. She nodded. I understand. And thank you for the reference you gave me for my med school application. You got it mailed in on time? Yes, I did. Now the wait to hear back. I believe you'll be a fine doctor. I just hope this, whatever it is, gets straightened out soon, or you'll be kicked out of the program. You need to fall in line, not flout authority, and do your own thing, without regards to orders. There's a reason why the system is set up the way it is, Nurse McClain. I understand, sir. Actually, she didn't understand. In her years of nursing, she'd noticed that doctors were revered as deities, and nurses were considered too far beneath them to be recognized. That didn't seem right at all. Weren't they all there to work for the good of the patients? Shouldn't they be on the same team? Apparently, that wasn't how things were in the real world, and she was becoming less enchanted with the real world all the time. Maybe once she was a doctor and had some clout, she could make some changes, but she was a woman, and a female doctor would never carry the clout of a male one. It was infuriating. Go get some rest, Dr. Hunsaker said. I see your day starts early tomorrow. Yes, sir. It does. Thank you. She stood up. I promise I'll do better. He gave one sharp nod. See that you do. Chapter 3. I might as well just hang a sign around my neck that says, "Ask me about my special powers." I was so obvious today. I usually hide it better, but with two such dire situations back to back, I had to act quickly, and I probably blew it big time. Tracy handed Rebekah a cherry 7-Up and sat down next to her on the couch. Okay, so, Dr. Hunsaker is starting to get a little suspicious, and you've got one paramedic asking questions. That's just 2 people, right? You can handle 2 people. Yes, I can handle the paramedic. I barely know him, and I'm only going to be seeing him in passing when he brings in more cases. Dr. Hunsaker, though? He's my boss. I work with him every single day. How am I supposed to handle him? Tracy shook her head. I don't know. I fix things, not people. It's too bad one of us didn't get the power to wipe someone's memory clean. We could take care of your little problem in a jiffy. Have you ever wondered why we got the powers we did? Mine makes sense, because I'm a nurse, and yours makes sense, because you sell cars, but none of the others really seem to fit, you know? They might not seem to fit, but I think we're each finding ways to use what we've been given. Tracy tilted her head to the side. Have you thought about telling Dr. Hunsaker the truth? Rebekah had been taking a sip of her drink and nearly choked on it. Tell him the truth? Can you imagine how that would go over? We're a walking, talking episode of The Twilight Zone. He would never believe me. Does he believe what you're telling him now? No. He knows I'm still holding something back. Then would it really do any harm? Rebekah put her drink on the coffee table and leaned back again. If he thinks I'm crazy, I'll lose my job. But I could lose it anyway for being impertinent. I don't know, Tracy. What should I do? We could call Marty. She should be back at her dorm by now. Or we could talk to her this weekend when she brings her laundry home. Can't believe she's about ready to graduate. Everything's changing so fast. Rebekah thought about her options. Would her precog tell me what to do, exactly? How does it work? I don't know. That's why you've got to ask her. Rebekah nodded. There was still so much they didn't understand about the benefits and limitations of these gifts. Peter, their cousin, was lucky. He'd known he was a precog his whole life, and it was the expected thing in his family. As the seventh son of a seventh son for generations back, his destiny had almost been foretold. Rebekah and her sisters had broken the mold. They weren't even sons, let alone all of the rest of it. I'll talk to her this weekend. It's a hard conversation to have long distance, and I probably couldn't afford that phone bill anyway. Yeah, it's hard to solve the problems of the universe in under 2 minutes. Tracy rested her hand on Rebekah's shoulder. Whatever you decide to do, just remember that we're all here for you. Even Heather clear out there in faraway Idaho, land of the potatoes. And wherever Jessica and Galen end up, now that they're all smitten and stuff. We stick together. You aren't going to start singing We Are Family, are you? Rebekah teased. No, but it's the perfect moment for it. Tracy grinned. Shouldn't you be going to bed about now? Yeah, I should. Rebekah stood up and stretched. Thanks, Tracy. I appreciate it. No problem. You know you can always count on me to be here when you need me. Unless I'm not home. In which case, you have other sisters to choose from. Pretty sure that's why Mom and Dad had so many of us, so we'd never run out of options. Yeah, I'm sure that had something to do with it. Rebekah smirked and shook her head. Good night. Her apartment wasn't too far away from Tracy's house, but she was tired enough that it felt like miles. She went inside, kicked off her shoes, and flopped onto her bed, not bothering to do anything else. Using her gift always made her tired, and she'd been pushed to the limit that day. It was time to sleep like a dead thing. Jeremy felt like a heel, wishing that someone would need to be taken to the emergency room so he could see Rebekah again. What kind of paramedic actually hoped bad things would happen to people? When the first half of his shift went by without a single emergency, he knew he was being punished for having such uncharitable thoughts. By the time his shift ended, he knew his fate was sealed. He was headed straight for hell. He'd better not tell his mother that. He clocked out, then drove straight to the hospital, hoping Rebekah would still be there. He was in luck. He pulled into the parking lot just in time to see her exiting the building. He parked the car and jogged across the lot to catch up with her. Hey, he said when he was still several yards away. She turned and looked at him, clearly surprised. Hi. What are you doing here? I didn't hear an ambulance pull in. No, I'm not here on a call. I actually hoped I could take you out to dinner. She shook her head. Jeremy, please don't make this awkward. I told you yesterday that this wasn't a good idea. I'm not trying to make this awkward, and I respect that you have secrets. But I couldn't sleep last night for thinking about it, and I just hoped that maybe if I asked again. She looked down at the ground, then back up at him, and he could see that she didn't know what to do. Okay, how about this? I'll have dinner with you, but I can't promise you anything else. No deep conversations, no sharing of secrets, no revelations or shocking announcements, okay? Dinner. Just one dinner. He grinned. That's a great start. Where would you like to go? Comida. I need Mexican. Perfect. He held out his arm and motioned toward his car. Would you like me to drive, or should we go separately? Let's each take our own cars. I don't want to have to come back later to pick mine up. Perfect, he said again. I'll see you at Comida in a few minutes. As he retraced his footsteps to his car, he couldn't believe that she'd said yes. Of course, that had been the outcome he'd been hoping for, but it was still hard to believe. He was going to have dinner with Rebekah McClain, who was without a doubt the most fascinating woman he'd ever met. Not to mention one of the prettiest. He parked at the restaurant, then waited by the front door until she pulled up so he could escort her inside. After they were seated and they each had a glass of ice water in front of them, he asked, "So, how was your day?" "Pretty quiet, actually. We didn't have any ambulances dropping off half-dead people, so that helped." A slight smile told him she was in a good mood. "I fished a pinto bean out of a little girl's nose, I helped do inventory on boxes and boxes of gauze, and I picked up some litter in the parking lot. It was all very eventful." "Not like yesterday," Jeremy replied, hoping to steer the conversation to what he really wanted to talk about. "Not at all like yesterday. Speaking of which, how was dinner with your parents?" "Oh, she was good," she deflected it right back to him. Okay, he could allow her that for now. "It was great. My mom made some chicken and mashed potatoes, and Greg's doing all right, well, mostly." "Greg?" "My brother. And he was in a car accident, right?" "Yeah. It did some damage to his spinal cord. He's in a wheelchair, but he also deals with a lot of pain." "And that's why you said he was mostly doing well, because of the pain?" Jeremy nodded. "They've put him on some new meds, but my mother says they haven't noticed a difference." Rebekah looked thoughtful. "I'd like to meet him sometime. Does he have any plans to come here for a visit?" "Not that I know of. It's hard for him to go places in cars because of the wheelchair and everything. Even his doctor appointments take all day because of the logistics." "I can imagine. He lives with your parents in San Antonio?" "Yeah." She took a sip of her water and went back to perusing her menu. When the waitress came back for their orders, Rebekah asked for a taco and enchilada platter, and Jeremy ordered the flautas. Then he said, "If you really want to meet Greg, I could take you with me on my next visit." He hoped he said that casually enough that she wouldn't think he was pushing the issue. He had the feeling that she wasn't a woman to be pushed. "I might like that." She took another sip of her water. "How was your day?" "Pretty much the same as yours, except I didn't have to pull beans out of anyone's nose. I'm a little jealous of that, actually. It might have livened things up a bit." "Oh, trust me, you don't want any part of that. There were boogers involved, and long tweezers, and let's just say, it's nothing like playing a game of Operation. I want to know who invented that thing, anyway. It's given a lot of people a very false idea of what it means to be in the medical profession." Jeremy laughed. He liked this girl's dry sense of humor, but he supposed he shouldn't think of her as a girl. She was a woman, but he was so used to hearing his mother call them girls. "I was never very good at that game anyway. I rocked it. I beat every single one of my sisters until they wouldn't even play with me anymore. But I still have issues with it because of the expectations it created. There's no blood in that game, no one's crying in pain. And there are no boogers," he finished for her. "Exactly." The waitress brought their food, and Rebekah dug in. "Haven't eaten since breakfast," she said by way of apology after she shoveled in her third bite. "I get it. I live on fruit snacks and tab most days, there isn't a lot of time to eat. He watched her, amused. You aren't afraid of spice? She raised an eyebrow, picked up the bowl of salsa from the table, and dumped it all over her enchiladas. I'm a McClain from Bagley, Texas, she replied. Spice should be afraid of me. They bantered back and forth all through dinner, and while he still wanted answers, he was able to put that aside and concentrate on getting to know her as a person apart from her mysteries. She was smart, funny, caring, involved in the community, she was perfect. He couldn't think of a better word to describe her. She was absolutely perfect. Do you snore? He asked her as she finished up her meal. Snore? Yeah. I'm trying to find some kind of flaw in you, but I can't. She threw her head back and laughed. You can't find a flaw in me? Seriously? Oh, my gosh. That's just too funny. Ask my sisters, they'll talk your ears off for hours. Okay. When? She stopped laughing and looked at him. What? When can I meet your sisters? We've already decided that you're going to meet my brother, it's only fair. She suddenly seemed unsure. I don't know, Jeremy. Remember, I said I couldn't promise you anything, and I'm already feeling a lot more involved than I ever intended to get. But isn't being involved a good thing? Why are you putting up so many walls against me? Because I don't know if telling you the truth is a good idea. She slid out of the bench. I need to go, I'm sorry. Rebekah, wait. Jeremy stood up as well and caught her arm. Listen, I know you don't want to hear this, but I like you. I like you a lot, and I can't believe that this is going to be our only date. When can I see you again? After I talk to my sister. With that strange reply, Rebekah left, and Jeremy was even more confused than he'd been before their date. Chapter 4. What's so secret that we're tiptoeing around and whispering in the laundry room? Marty asked, glancing over her shoulder. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is Candace still keeping Mom and Dad occupied in the living room? Rebekah asked. Yeah. Now, what's up? And talk fast. You know how suspicious Mom gets about clandestine meetings. Okay. So, 2 things. My boss at work is really breathing down my neck, and I'm running out of excuses. Do you have any insights about whether I'd be safe telling him about my gift? You want to tell your boss? That seems pretty risky. I know, but he's going to figure it out or fire me or something anyway. Marty looked thoughtful. I'm not picking up on anything in regards to that, so I'm not going to be much help. You're probably safe to go for it if I'm not getting flashing danger signs and stuff. Oh, great. So basically, I have to decide for myself. Marty laughed. Isn't that what you have to do anyway, regardless of what I tell you? Yes, but you make things easier. Marty's expression became serious for a moment. That's just it. Yes, we have cool gifts, but we can't rely on them so much that we forget about our other gifts, the ones we've always had, like common sense and gut feelings. We could get zapped by another power surge someday and lose our powers, and then we'd be sunk. You're right, and I shouldn't expect you to follow me around and tell me what to do anyway. That's not fair to you. But there is something else you wanted to ask me. Rebekah felt her cheeks get warm. Yeah. There's a guy. I knew it. I mean, I didn't know it, but I suspected. Because you're acting all weird. I'm not acting weird. Yes, you are. Now, tell me about him. His name is Jeremy, and he's a paramedic. I met him at the hospital, not surprising, because I'm there all the time, and he saw me diagnose 2 patients. And now he's suspicious, and he wants answers, but I think he also wants a relationship, and I just don't know if I can trust him." Marty raised an eyebrow. "What's your gut telling you?" That I can." "And you're right. Again, I'm not getting any specifics here, but I'm also not getting any danger signs. If you were thinking about doing something dangerous, I'd be all over it, so you must be on the right track." "Thanks, Marty. I appreciate it." Rebekah startled as she heard her mother's voice. "Now, what's going on in here? Why are you hovering over my washer and dryer like there's something incredibly special?" "I was trying to explain to Marty how to use the washer, and she's pretending like she doesn't understand," Rebekah replied. "I understand how to use the washer just fine," Marty replied. "I just don't understand why I should use the washer when Mom wants to use it for me." "Mom, let's be honest with each other here," Rebekah said. "Do you really want to wash Marty's laundry?" Rebekah had meant her question to be funny, and she was surprised when Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "It's like this, honey," she said. "I've spent half my life taking care of you girls. Being your mother is who I am, and now that you're all grown up, you don't need me as much anymore. If helping Marty with her laundry means that she still needs me for something, then yes, I do want to do it." "Oh, Mom." Both girls threw their arms around their mother and gave her a tight squeeze. "We'll always need you," Rebekah said. "No one else in the world could take your place." "Sometimes it just doesn't feel that way," Barbara replied. "And now with Heather married and Jessica and Galen engaged, and you about to head off to medical school and Marty graduating, everything's changing." "I was thinking about that too," Rebekah replied. "But change doesn't have to be bad, does it? It means new sons-in-law to love, and someday there will be grandbabies, and you've always talked about how you want to fill this whole house up on Thanksgiving and Christmas. This is just taking a step closer to that goal." "You're right." Barbara pulled a Kleenex from her pocket and wiped her eyes. "I shouldn't be so pessimistic. I think I've just lost a bit of myself along the way, and I'm not sure who I am if I'm not a full-time mother anymore." "I saw a talk show about this the other day," Marty said. "I think it was Donahue. Anyway, these women were saying that they woke up one morning and didn't know who they were, so they went off on these crazy adventures to find themselves." "Mom, please tell me you're not going to get tattoos or run off with a rich Colombian coffee bean magnate or something like that." "Dad would be devastated," Rebekah chimed in. "No, I'm not going to do anything like that," Barbara replied, now smiling. "I do think I might take some classes at the community center, though. Macrame would be nice, don't you think?" Rebekah wasn't convinced that one could find oneself while doing macrame because it's not like you could lose yourself from lack of macrame, but she wasn't about to argue. If it made her mother happy, she'd support her in it. The next morning, Rebekah lay in bed for a few minutes and allowed herself to bask in the sunlight that was streaming through her window. She had the day off, and she was going to church with her family and then eating at her parents', and then she was going to take a nap and possibly take another nap too. When she had a lot of shifts, she often went without sleep, and she could feel it catching up to her. She put on her light pink sweater dress, thinking that the spring weather was just cool enough to get away with it, then grabbed a couple of bangles from her jewelry box. She didn't have time to eat breakfast, but she grabbed a granola bar on her way out the door, remembering with a smile what Jeremy had said about living on fruit snacks. You did what you had to do sometimes. When she walked into the church, she spotted her family immediately because they were definitely hard to miss, but she also saw Jeremy there sitting toward the back. She was going to walk over and say hello to him, but Candace came up to her and tugged on her arm. "Mom says you're late and she wants you to sit down before the pastor starts talking or you'll cause an embarrassing scene," Candace hissed. "I'm not that late, and yes, I'm coming," Rebekah replied. She slid into her seat just as the pastor stepped up to the pulpit. All right, maybe she was that late, but still, everything was fine. There was no need to make a big deal out of it. The sermon was particularly nice, what Rebekah caught of it. She wished she'd had that extra moment to speak with Jeremy before the service started. She wondered if this was his new congregation, or if his persistence had taken a creepy turn and he was now stalking her everywhere, including to her place of worship. Of course, if he was being creepy, he probably wouldn't admit to it, so talking to him about it might not do any good anyway. As soon as the crowd started to disperse, she worked her way toward the back and found his pew. "Hi," she said. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to see you either," he replied. "I drove past this church last week and thought it looked like a friendly place, so I thought I'd give it a try." "Have you gone here long?" "As long as I can remember," she said. "What do you think of it so far?" "It's great. I really liked how the sermon brought out the parable of the widow's mite. I'd never thought of it that way before." Rebekah wanted to ask him what he meant, but she didn't want to admit that she'd been too distracted by him to pay attention. "It was definitely thought-provoking," she replied instead. More lies. It was a good thing she wasn't Pinocchio. "Hello there." Barbara had come up behind Rebekah and was now smiling at Jeremy. "I'm Rebekah's mother." "Who might you be?" "Hello, Mrs. McClain. I'm Jeremy Burton. I just moved to town, and I met Rebekah at the hospital. I'm a paramedic." Rebekah watched as her mother's face took on a whole new layer of happy. "Welcome to Bagley, Jeremy. Will you come over to the house and eat with us? It's a Sunday tradition." Jeremy glanced at Rebekah as if asking her permission. She gave him a slight nod. Yes, she'd been trying to get rid of him, but Sunday dinner was different from dating. And Marty had said she could trust him, so. "I'd love to come, Mrs. McClain. Thanks so much for inviting me. Just follow us over, there are about 4 cars going that way, so you won't have a chance to get lost." Barbara threw a smile at Rebekah. It was all Rebekah could do not to laugh. Her mother seemed to think she was helping Rebekah catch a man, but she didn't know Jeremy and Rebekah had already been out. "Sounds great." Jeremy bent down and picked up a messenger bag that had been sitting next to him on the bench. Looked like he'd brought his own Bible. That was pretty cool, actually. Rebekah didn't know a lot of guys who did that. She got into her car and pulled out of the parking lot, then glanced in her rearview mirror to make sure Jeremy was behind her. Getting lost wasn't actually possible in Bagley. Even if he got turned around, all he'd have to do was ask someone and they'd set him straight. But it was nice to know he was there, and she realized that she liked how she felt when she was around him. That didn't mean she was ready to divulge all the family secrets, but she was getting closer to it. Once at the house, she introduced Jeremy all around, finishing with, "Our oldest sister, Heather, lives in Idaho now, so you'll just have to pretend you've met her." "Well, you sort of have met her if you've met the rest of us," Jessica said with a laugh. "We're like versions of the same person, except not." They sat down at the table and helped themselves to spaghetti. Barbara made her own sauce from tomatoes she grew in the garden, and it was honestly better than any sauce Rebekah had ever tried from the store. Jeremy seemed to like it too and had 3 servings, which of course made Barbara like him all the more. "Your family's great," Jeremy said as Rebekah walked him out to his car. "Do they always just bring people home from church with them?" "Yes, all the time," Rebekah answered. "Especially if that person looks hungry." "That's so awesome. Thanks for including me today." He rested his hand on the roof of her car. "I meant what I said about wanting to see you again, Rebekah, but I'll respect your space if that's really what you want." "That's the problem. I don't know what I want." She'd never had so many conflicting thoughts and feelings before. She liked Jeremy, she really did, and 2 years ago, she would have dated him with no hesitation at all. But that would have been before the zap, as Jessica called it, and before their powers surfaced. That made everything so much harder. Jeremy reached out and took her hand, rubbing it gently with his thumb. "At least that's not a flat-out no," he said softly. "It's not a no. It's just not a yes. Not yet." She wished she could give him some kind of answer, but she was still sorting through all the possible outcomes. If she wasn't in danger of losing her job, that would also make things easier. "Well, I'm a pretty patient guy." He grinned, then let go of her hand. "Thanks again for the great meal. I'll see you later." He got in his car and drove away, and Rebekah immediately felt the difference. There was a little hollow spot in her chest now because he was gone. Chapter 5. Rebekah dashed across the floor and grabbed hold of one side of the gurney as Jeremy pushed it through the emergency room doors. Her heart had given a little thump when she realized it was him, but she'd immediately gone into work mode when her eyes landed on the patient. "What have we got?" "Patient is unresponsive and her breath sounds are shallow," Jeremy replied. "History of heart disease. Her husband found her on the kitchen floor." "How long ago?" "About 10 minutes. Rebekah glanced around, but didn't see Dr. Hunsaker yet. It sometimes took a minute for him to reach the ER from his office, or he might have been dealing with a matter somewhere else in the hospital. She reached out and touched the patient's windpipe, focusing on what Jeremy had said about her breath sounds. "Oh, that was an easy fix." She grabbed the woman and sat her up, then positioned herself to do the Heimlich maneuver. As she brought her hands in and up, a chunk of food flew out of the woman's mouth and ricocheted off the opposite wall. The patient took a huge gasping breath, then sagged into Rebekah's arms again. This time, though, she was conscious. She was choking? Jeremy sounded incredulous. "With her history, we thought for sure she'd had a heart attack." "That would make the most sense," Rebekah replied. "Where's her husband now?" "Sitting in the chairs in the waiting room. He was pretty upset, so my partner stayed with him." Rebekah nodded. That was probably the best way to handle it. Her patient was elderly, meaning that her husband likely was too, and his health had to be kept in consideration as well. She checked to make sure her patient was comfortable, then walked down the hall toward the waiting room. "Hello there," she said as she approached. "Mr. Donaldson," he replied, coming to his feet. "I'm Ian Donaldson. My wife is Marge." "Mr. Donaldson, your wife is going to be fine. She was choking on some food, and when you found her, she'd passed out from restricted oxygen. She was able to get just enough air to stay alive. I did the Heimlich maneuver, and the food has been ejected from her windpipe." "Oh, thank goodness," Mr. Donaldson said. "Can I see her?" "Of course," Rebekah replied. "Come this way." Jeremy motioned to his partner, and they headed back out to their ambulance. Jeremy gave Rebekah a smile as they passed. Mr. Donaldson took his wife's hand in his. "You sure gave me a scare," he told her, a tremble in his voice. "I thought I was losing you. You won't have such an easy time getting rid of me." Her voice was a little scratchy, but her humor was obvious, and Rebekah smiled. "Rest here for a little bit, and then we'll send you home." She stepped out of the cubicle and walked over to the nurse's station to fill out the paperwork. Dr. Hunsaker was there waiting for her. "A word, Nurse McClain?" Without saying anything, she followed him to his office. This time, he didn't even wait until she was seated before he began. "I've been patient, probably a great deal more patient than I should have been, but now I need an explanation. I'm told that patient had a history of heart disease and came in unresponsive with shallow breath sounds, and you immediately did the Heimlich. How did you draw that conclusion? Why weren't you following proper protocol for a suspected heart attack?" He didn't sound angry, but he did sound frustrated. Rebekah knew she'd pushed the boundaries of his goodwill a little too far by refusing to answer. Taking a deep breath and praying Marty was right, she said, "Dr. Hunsaker, I'd like to explain, but first, could you please sit down?" He scowled. No good conversation ever starts that way. I know, but it can't be helped. He sat down and laced his fingers on the desk in front of him. I'm sitting. Please proceed. All right. Where to start? So, you've noticed that I seem to know what's wrong with our patients as soon as they come in. Yes, I've noticed that. I want the how and the why. I can't give you a how or a why, but I'll give you what I can. She ignored his increasingly deepening scowl and continued. Just over a year ago, I was at my parents' house, and we experienced a lightning flash and a power outage. On that night, each of my sisters and myself were given some kind of gift. Mine is that I can diagnose illnesses. When I touch someone, I can feel heat radiating off the afflicted area, and a slight vibration. Then I have a sense of knowing what's going on there. It's hard to describe, but it's like I'm suddenly absolutely competent in how to solve the problem. And sometimes I don't have to touch them, sometimes I just know. Dr. Hunsaker's face had gone completely slack as he listened. You have powers, he said at last. Yes. But not like Superman powers, I'm not actually sure what to call it. Incredulity was all over his face. I have no idea how to respond to that, he said at last. I've never encountered anything like this. Is it some kind of witchcraft? Rebekah shook her head emphatically. No. None of us practice witchcraft, or want to. This just happened, we didn't seek it out or anything. She paused. There is some history in our family of unusual talents that are passed from father to son, but we don't have any idea how we got involved, since we're all girls. Dr. Hunsaker took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I don't think you're lying to me, he said after a long minute. I've seen the evidence that something's going on, and your explanation makes about as much sense as anything I could come up with. But I do need just a little more evidence, Nurse McClain. What would you like me to do? Come with me. He stood up and made his way to the other wing of the hospital, where the surgical patients were being treated. We're going to play a little game, if you'll indulge me. I'm going to introduce you to several people, and you'll tell me what they're being treated for. She nodded. Yes, let's do it. And thank you for being willing to hear me out. Believe me, I'm as skeptical as the day is long, but I also can't deny something when it's happening right in front of my face. This first room belongs to Mr. Kowalski. They stepped inside, and Dr. Hunsaker approached the bed. Mr. Kowalski, how are you feeling today? The man coughed into a tissue he had balled up in his hand. I'm fine, document. Just waiting for my wife to come in, she's usually here by now. Probably traffic. Probably. You'll let the nurse know if you need anything, right? Sure will, document. They stepped back into the hall, and Rebekah said, he has black spots on his lungs, caused by years of smoking. Lung cancer, advanced. And his prognosis? She blinked. She'd never stopped to consider that before, she'd always been focused on solving the problem in the here and now. 3 weeks, she replied as the knowledge formed in her gut. That's just remarkable, Dr. Hunsaker said, almost to himself. As they moved down the hall, Rebekah diagnosed a deviated septum, a badly inflamed hemorrhoid, a shattered tibia, and the need for a hysterectomy. After the hysterectomy patient, they returned to Dr. Hunsaker's office, where he sank into his chair as though all the strength had gone out of him. I can't deny it, what you have is a gift, he said at length. Now the question is, what is to be done about it? You don't want people to know, I assume, especially since it took you this long to tell me. That's right, sir. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable around me. I'm not crazy, I'm not a witch, I'm just using a gift I was given, and hopefully, I'll be able to do some good in the world. And this is why you're leaving nursing to become a doctor. That's right. No one questions doctors like they do nurses, and being a doctor would give me access to more patients and broaden the ways I can do my job. That's admirable. It really is. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her. How can I help? Chills ran down her arms. He was taking this so much better than she'd even dared to imagine. Just keep my secret, she said. He nodded. I can do that. I hope you know that means I can't give you any preferential treatment. You'll have all the same duties as you did before, including the more unpleasant ones. I understand that completely, sir. I don't want to be treated any differently. He stood up and reached out to shake her hand. I'm honored to have you on our team, but just so you're aware, I was honored before I knew about your gift. You've always been an asset to this hospital. Thank you, sir. Oh, and some milk of magnesia should help with that heartburn. She grinned as he looked at her in surprise, and then he chuckled. Heartburn you caused, I'll have you know. Yes, sir. And I'm sorry about that. And there you go. Jeremy finished bandaging up the wound and fastened it with a strip of medical tape. Make sure to change this dressing every day, all right? And you'd better check in with your doctor and let him know what happened. All right. Thank you. The woman who'd called had been chopping onions and somehow managed to slice her finger pretty deeply. It wasn't bad enough for stitches, though it had bled quite a lot and scared her. Jeremy put everything back in his kit and carried it out to the ambulance where Frank, his partner, had started up the engine. Wish she'd just gone into her doctor's office, Frank said, grumbling a little. We could have gotten a real call while we were here. Jeremy knew what Frank meant, but he replied, no real harm done, and she was in shock. Driving would have been a bad idea. Yeah, I guess you're right. I just don't want to miss saving someone's life because of an owie finger. Jeremy didn't reply. Again, he knew what Frank meant, and it also wasn't his job to keep his partner ultra-positive all the time. They had to blow off steam somehow so their frustrations wouldn't impact their patients. So, got anything going on tonight? Frank asked. Want to go down to the bar with me and watch the game? I'm hoping I'll have a date, Jeremy replied. You're hoping? Yeah. I need to go ask her. Frank laughed. That's usually how it's done, right? Well, if she says no, come on down. They do half-price wings during games. Will do. Or maybe he wouldn't. He wasn't really into football, but he appreciated Frank's invitation. It meant he was starting to fit in here. After their shift ended, Frank and Jeremy went their separate ways, and Jeremy headed over to the hospital. He'd been lucky enough to catch Rebekah on her way home on Saturday. He wondered if that would happen again, but she wasn't anywhere to be seen, and her car was gone too. He wished he'd asked for her address or her phone number, but he was trying to give her space, and space was overrated. Fine, he muttered. He needed to pick up some groceries anyway. He'd been too busy to stock up in his new place. As he pulled into the grocery store, he noticed a familiar car sitting outside, and he started to laugh. It had to be destiny. There wasn't another explanation for it. I swear, I'm not following you around, he said when he caught up to Rebekah on the ice cream aisle. Yes, I did go to the hospital to try to find you, but running into you here is a complete coincidence. Sure. That's what all the creepy stalkers say. She looked into his basket. You haven't even gotten anything yet. I just got here. Very likely story. She pointed to the display case. Chocolate or vanilla? This is where we find out a lot about each other. I'm more of a rocky road sort of person, he replied. Very good choice. Do you know why it's called Rocky Road? I have no idea. It was invented during the Depression, and they wanted a name that would cheer people up. He raised an eyebrow. Then why didn't they name it something like fluffy bunnies or sparkling unicorns? I don't know. I retain useless trivia, not the answers to random hypothetical questions. I see. He reached into the case and pulled out a quart of Rocky Road. Either way, you talked me into it. Then I've fulfilled my purpose. They continued to chat as they moved through the store, and Jeremy was surprised at how fun it was to shop with a friend. He hated going to the grocery store, but Rebekah made it much less painful. She questioned half the things he put in his cart, but that was part of what made it fun. Wait, she said as he reached for a jar of goober grape. What are you doing? I'm buying goober grape, he replied. That's why my hand is moving toward it. She shook her head impatiently. Do you realize how much money you're wasting? Look. Here's a jar of peanut butter, and here's a jar of grape jelly. When you compare them ounce for ounce to that horrible gimmicky concoction you're trying to buy, you'll realize just how much money you'd save mixing it together yourself. Pennies per sandwich. Pennies. And do you know what pennies add up to? He blinked. Dollars? Yes. But you forgot something. He picked up the jar of goober grape, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, and took off the lid. Stripes, he said, angling it so she could see. And stripes are worth the extra money to you? Stripes are worth quite a bit in my world. You have to take your entertainment wherever you can get it. He put the lid back on the jar, then put the jar in his cart. Things are starting to become clear to me now. You've just moved to town and you have no better entertainment than buying striped jam, so you've chosen to turn your attention to me to alleviate your boredom. Well, it's not as desperate as all that, but yes, I do enjoy striped jam. She laughed. You're kind of hopeless. Did you know that? Sadly, yes. He leaned on the handle of his cart. Let me run home, put my food away, and then come over. We can bake a frozen pizza, and I'll rent a movie on my way. I'd invite you to my place, but I've got some boxes stacked up in the living room that I need to get rid of before I'll be fit for company. That sounds reasonable, Rebekah said. Just one question. What kind of pizza? Oh, she really was testing him, wasn't she? Supreme, he said after thinking it over. He didn't know how traditional or untraditional she was, but he did think that she'd want more than just plain pepperoni. Good call, she said with a grin. All right, it's a date. She reached into her purse and pulled out a little notebook and pen. Here's my address. Give me about half an hour, all right? As you can tell from my lovely hospital attire, I'm here straight from work, and I want a quick shower. No problem. They went through 2 different checkout lanes, and Jeremy paused to make sure the bag boy was helping Rebekah load up before he took off. He had a lot to do in that half hour, but he wasn't going to make her deal with a whole cart of groceries by herself.